My name is Darlene, and I'm 57 years old. I gave 10 years of my life to a man who swore he loved me until the day police handcuffed me in my own kitchen for crimes he committed. He stood there, pretending to cry, while everyone believed his lies. He walked away free, got a promotion, and a new girlfriend. But I didn't break. I rebuilt myself. And when I married his boss's daughter, I made sure the world finally saw who he really was live on television. For most of my life, I believed in simplicity, small routines, early mornings, and quiet evenings. I had a cozy little home on the outskirts of Portland, where my days revolved around work at a local library and volunteering at the animal shelter. I was content, not because life was perfect, but because it was peaceful. That peace vanished the day I met Calvin. Calvin entered my life like a well-written novel full of charm, warmth, and perfectly timed words. I met him at a charity event my library hosted. He was handsome in a confident, almost disarming way, with the kind of smile that made you forget your doubts for a while. He said he admired strong women, and I was naive enough to believe that meant he respected them. He asked me out for coffee, and that one coffee turned into a routine. We'd meet every Friday at the same cafe, laughing over pastries and stories about our childhoods. Before I knew it, he became part of my everyday life. Calvin ran a small tech business, something about software solutions for small companies. I didn't understand much of it, but I trusted him completely. He often complained about stress, late payments, or unreliable clients. I listened, comforted, and supported him in every way I could. When his business hit a rough patch, I dipped into my savings to help him. It felt like what any loving partner would do. He always promised he'd pay me back. Our relationship grew fast. Maybe too fast. Within a year, he moved into my house. He said he had this way of twisting my thoughts until I doubted myself instead of him. Looking back, I realized he wasn't just charming, he was calculated. Then came the proposal. It wasn't grand or romantic, but quiet and sudden. He said he didn't want to wait anymore, that he couldn't imagine a life without me. It should have been the happiest moment of my life, but something inside me hesitated. It felt rushed, almost forced. Around that time, rumors about his company started spreading something about missing funds and unpaid investors. When I asked him about it, he laughed it off and said competitors were trying to ruin him. I believed him, or maybe I wanted to. We planned a small engagement party. I spent days preparing, ironing my best dress, cooking his favorite dishes, and inviting the few people who still talked to me. The night before the party, we were sitting in the living room, and he seemed oddly calm, almost distant. I thought he was just tired. I remember making tea, while he sat quietly on the couch, typing something on his laptop. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled and said he was sending invoices. I kissed his cheek and went to bed early, thinking everything would be fine in the morning. But the morning didn't bring celebration, it brought chaos. I was in the kitchen, arranging flowers, when I heard loud knocking on the door. Before I could even react, 2 officers walked in, asking for me by full name. I thought it was a mistake, maybe some paperwork confusion. Calvin appeared behind them, his face pale, eyes wide with fake concern. When they said the words fraud and embezzlement, my knees nearly gave out. They told me I was under arrest for financial crimes linked to Calvin's company under my name, my bank accounts, my signature. I couldn't even speak. I turned to Calvin, searching his face for explanation, for comfort, for truth. He stepped closer, pretending to hold me, whispering, "Don't worry, we'll fix this." But something in his tone was wrong, cold, detached. As they handcuffed me, I saw the faintest smirk cross his face. That was the moment I realized the man I loved, the man I trusted with my heart and my future, had just destroyed me to save himself. I was handcuffed in my own kitchen while Calvin pretended to cry. The smell of freshly brewed coffee still lingered in the air, mixing with the cold scent of fear that suddenly filled the room. The officers spoke in firm, practiced tones, reading me my rights as if I were a criminal. My hands trembled as they pulled me toward the door, my heart racing so violently I could barely breathe. Calvin's voice echoed behind me, pretending to plead with them, acting confused, asking what was happening. But when I turned back to look at him, I caught the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes before he quickly lowered them. That one look told me everything. I wasn't just collateral damage in some misunderstanding. He had planned this. The next few days felt like a blur of humiliation and disbelief. The police questioned me endlessly, presenting document after document that bore my name and signature. Bank transfers, emails, forged invoices, all tied directly to me. I tried explaining that I didn't even have access to Calvin's business accounts, but they looked at me with polite skepticism. Everything led back to my name, my email, my phone number. I had unknowingly signed documents he'd placed in front of me over the years, trusting him when he said they were just forms for his business registration or tax matters. He had used that trust as his weapon. Calvin visited once during the early days of the investigation. He brought me food and played the part of the concerned partner, holding my hand as he told me everything would be fine. He said he believed in me, that the truth would come out. I almost wanted to believe him, but something in his eyes felt rehearsed. Later that night, I saw him on television, speaking to reporters outside our house. He told them he was devastated that the woman he loved could betray his business this way. His voice cracked at all the right places, and the cameras ate it up. "I'm shocked," he said, wiping a fake tear. "I trusted her with everything." In that single moment, he flipped the story. He was the victim, and I was the thief. My world collapsed faster than I thought possible. Friends stopped returning my calls. The library suspended me pending the outcome of the investigation. My neighbors whispered when I stepped outside to get the mail. It was as if my entire identity had been rewritten by his lies. I sold my car to afford bail and used what was left of my savings for a lawyer who treated me like a lost cause. When I couldn't pay him anymore, he dropped the case. I remember sitting in my dim kitchen one night, staring at the spot where Calvin used to sit, wondering how love could turn into this kind of ruin. A few weeks later, I met Jessa. She was a young, sharp attorney who had just started her own practice. She had read about my case in the news and reached out, offering to represent me pro bono. I didn't understand why at first, but she said my story reminded her of her mother, someone who had been manipulated by a man who took everything. Jessa was the only person who spoke to me without judgment. She combed through every file, every email, every bank statement. She believed me, and that belief gave me strength when I had none left. But the deeper she dug, the clearer it became that Calvin had covered his tracks with precision. Every transaction looked legitimate. Every password had been changed. Even the IP addresses used for the transfers traced back to my computer. He had spent years building this web around me, waiting for the perfect time to pull the thread. It was almost artful, in a horrifying way. I started to see how much of my life he had quietly controlled the finances, the paperwork, even my online accounts. He hadn't just stolen money, he had stolen my name. The case dragged on for months. Each court date felt like a funeral for another piece of my dignity. Calvin showed up every time, sitting behind his lawyer, shaking his head sadly whenever the prosecution mentioned him. The press adored his loyalty. He never said anything cruel directly, but his silence spoke volumes. It painted me as guilty without him needing to say the words. I began to feel invisible, like I'd been erased and rewritten as someone else's villain. One evening, after another exhausting day in court, I found a small flash drive among some old documents Calvin had left behind. Out of curiosity, I plugged it into my laptop. It was mostly filled with business spreadsheets and reports. But one file caught my eye, an old voice memo labeled simply "Client Call." When I played it, my heart stopped. It was Calvin's voice, discussing a transaction that had supposedly been authorized by Darlene. He laughed and said, "She doesn't even read what she signs." The recording wasn't enough to prove his guilt legally, but it was the first tangible proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. I played it over and over, memorizing his tone, the arrogance, the calm cruelty behind it. That sound stayed with me, fueling a quiet fire I didn't know I still had. Jessa tried submitting the recording as supplemental evidence, but the court dismissed it as inconclusive. "Insufficient proof," they said. Like the words could erase what I'd lived through. Eventually, the charges were dropped not because they found Calvin guilty, but because they couldn't conclusively prove my guilt. I walked out of that courthouse technically free, but my reputation, my savings, and my trust in people were gone. The system had cleared me, but the world still saw me as a woman who got away with something. After the trial, I moved into a small apartment across town. I avoided old friends and familiar places. My reflection in the mirror looked like a ghost of the woman I once was. But in the quiet of those lonely nights, I began piecing together fragments of my strength. I replayed that voice memo in my head and started noticing other clues. He had missed a shared password he forgot to delete, a file saved under my name that didn't match my writing style. Little details that spoke to his arrogance. He thought he'd erased me, but he'd left fingerprints everywhere. It took time, but that bitterness started hardening into resolve. I realized I wasn't broken, I was awake. Calvin thought he had buried me under his lies, but he had only planted the seed of my revenge. I didn't want pity or sympathy anymore. I wanted justice, quiet and deliberate. Then, one night as I scrolled through the news, I froze. There he was, smiling in a crisp suit, shaking hands with a man whose name I recognized from the headlines. The caption read, "Calvin Blake promoted to senior executive under CEO Richard Montgomery." And standing beside him, holding his arm, was a woman I'd never seen before, beautiful, elegant, clearly from a wealthy family. Calvin had not only escaped justice, he had climbed higher than ever, but this time, I wouldn't look away. This time, I would be the one writing the ending. He was living the life he stole from me, and I wasn't done yet. For months after the charges were dropped, I lived quietly, deliberately, as if moving too fast might shatter what little I had left. My apartment was small but clean. My days structured around part-time work at a bookstore and evening shifts at a community center. I'd traded designer handbags for secondhand sweaters, dinner parties for frozen meals. But for the first time in years, every decision was mine. The peace was fragile, but it was real. The only constant disturbance was Calvin's name, which had a way of finding me even when I tried not to look. It slipped through headlines, whispers, and memories that clung too tight to fade. One cold morning, Jessa stopped by with coffee and a hesitant expression. She still checked in on me regularly, though my pride often got in the way of letting her help. She hesitated before speaking, as if weighing whether I could handle what she was about to say. "You might want to sit down," she warned. I braced myself, already guessing the name that would follow. "Calvin's in the news again. He's moved up." She slid her phone across the table. There he was, smiling beside a group of executives at a sleek corporate event. The caption read, "Calvin Blake joins Meridian Media as Director of Operations under CEO Richard Montgomery." Meridian Media, a powerhouse in the industry, known for high-profile clients, national broadcasts, and its founder's obsession with reputation. I'd read about Richard Montgomery before, a man who believed image was everything. And beside Calvin, his hand delicately placed on her arm, stood a woman I instantly recognized from society pages, Vivian Montgomery, Richard's daughter. She was beautiful in that effortless way money allows, poised, intelligent, with a soft smile that didn't yet know betrayal. My stomach twisted. Of course Calvin had found his next target. As Jessa watched my face, she said quietly, "Don't do anything reckless, Darlene. He's not worth it." But her words faded into the background. Reckless wasn't the word for what I was thinking. Calculated was closer. I wasn't looking to destroy him out of spite. I wanted justice, truth, balance. He had built his new life on the ashes of mine. It was time I learned how to take that life apart, piece by piece. In the following weeks, I began to research Meridian Media. I spent long nights scrolling through press releases, watching interviews, studying everything I could about the company's culture. Richard Montgomery had built his empire on two principles: loyalty and public image. Anyone tarnishing that image was cut off immediately. The irony wasn't lost on me. Calvin, the master of deception, had tied himself to a man who valued integrity above all else. That knowledge became the first glimmer of my plan. Through careful observation, I pieced together the company's structure. I discovered that Meridian was expanding its charitable wing, a media initiative focused on education and community storytelling. That meant new hiring rounds, public visibility, and heavy oversight from both Richard and Vivienne. I needed to get inside, not as an intruder, but as someone who belonged. I wasn't going to attack Calvin from the outside. I was going to dismantle his world from within. Every night after work, I practiced interviews in front of my mirror, rehearsing confidence that felt foreign at first. I updated my resume, highlighting my years of administrative experience and community involvement. It wasn't fabricated, I simply reframed my story. I wasn't a disgraced woman trying to rebuild. I was a capable professional looking for purpose. Slowly, I began to recognize my own reflection again. Not the broken, humiliated version Calvin left behind, but someone sharper, calmer, quietly dangerous. While I planned, I couldn't help but keep an eye on Calvin's digital footprint. He was everywhere: photos at corporate galas, posts about leadership seminars, self-congratulatory quotes about perseverance. He loved the camera, the illusion of success, and Vivienne was always there beside him, smiling proudly. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I'd stare at their pictures longer than I meant to. I didn't hate her. In fact, I pitied her. She reminded me of who I used to be, the woman who believed in him. The woman he would eventually destroy. One evening, I watched an interview Vivienne gave online. She spoke about her passion for journalism and the company's commitment to ethical storytelling. Her words were sincere, her heart too open for the cutthroat industry she was part of. It struck me that she had no idea who Calvin really was. That realization solidified my purpose. I didn't just want revenge, I wanted to protect her from the same betrayal that nearly ruined me. Jessa noticed the shift in my focus. Over dinner one night, she said, "You're studying him, aren't you?" I didn't deny it. "Darlene," she sighed, setting down her fork, "don't let revenge become your new life. You've fought too hard to get your peace back." I met her eyes and replied softly, "This isn't about revenge anymore, it's about correction." She didn't argue further, but the concern in her eyes lingered. Weeks passed before the opportunity I'd been waiting for appeared. Meridian Media announced new openings for their communications and community outreach team. The roles required organizational skills, discretion, and empathy, qualities I had in abundance. I spent a full night perfecting my application, tailoring it to align with their values. When I hit submit, my hands shook slightly. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. The waiting was torture. Every phone buzz made my heart skip. When the email finally came, I reread it twice to be sure it was real. "We're pleased to invite you for an interview at Meridian Media headquarters." It was happening. The plan I'd crafted quietly, patiently, was finally in motion. I called Jessa immediately. She hesitated, then said, "If you're doing this, at least promise me you'll stay careful. Don't confront him." "Not yet." I promised, though deep down I knew that confronting him was inevitable. The morning of the interview arrived like the first act of a play I'd written myself. I dressed carefully, professional but understated, the picture of composure. My reflection in the mirror met my gaze with quiet confidence. I reminded myself that this wasn't about anger anymore. It was about control. The control he once stole from me. The Meridian building stood tall and gleaming, its glass facade reflecting the city's restless energy. I walked through the revolving doors, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The receptionist smiled, guiding me to the waiting area outside the executive offices. My nerves fluttered, but I kept my breathing steady. I had rehearsed this moment countless times. As I took a seat, I noticed the sound of low conversation nearby. I looked up and froze. Sitting across from me, dressed in an immaculate navy suit, was Calvin. His hair was neatly combed, his confidence radiating like a well-polished performance. He looked up from his phone, and for a brief, electrifying moment, our eyes met. His expression didn't change, just the faintest flicker of recognition before that same smug smile curved his lips. The air between us thickened with unspoken history. I straightened my posture, returning his look with calm indifference. I wasn't the woman he destroyed anymore. This time, he had no idea what kind of storm had just walked into his world. He didn't even flinch when he saw me, he smirked. That same condescending curl of his lips that once made me melt now only fueled the cold fire in my chest. We sat in that pristine waiting room surrounded by glass walls and the faint hum of polished ambition. His eyes swept over me, pausing for only a heartbeat, before he looked back down at his phone as if I were nothing more than an echo from a past he'd already rewritten. I told myself not to react, not to let him see even a flicker of recognition in my face. I had walked into this world prepared, but I hadn't prepared for how visceral it would feel to breathe the same air as him again. The receptionist called my name, breaking the tension. I rose calmly, clutching the small portfolio in my hands. As I walked past him, his cologne, that same musky, expensive scent, hit me like a ghost from another life. I didn't look back. Inside the conference room, the hiring panel was waiting. 3 executives sat behind a sleek black table, their faces polite but guarded. I took my seat, smiled confidently, and began speaking with the kind of steady assurance I hadn't known I still possessed. Years of survival had toughened me, refined me. I told them about my organizational experience, my communication background, my ability to manage crises calmly and efficiently. I didn't need to oversell myself. I simply told the truth, the kind that sounded like professionalism instead of desperation. They asked thoughtful questions, and I met each one with a poised, well-prepared response. Somewhere between my second and third answer, I could sense their interest shifting. When I walked out 20 minutes later, Calvin was still in the waiting area, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up, his expression mildly curious. I smiled just enough to unsettle him, then left without another word. By the time I got home that evening, an email was waiting in my inbox. "Congratulations," it read. "We're pleased to offer you the position of Communications Associate at Meridian Media." I sat there for a long moment, staring at the screen, letting the satisfaction settle in. The first door had opened. My first week was a blur of orientation meetings, digital access setup, and polite introductions. Meridian Media was every bit as polished as its reputation suggested: glass offices, open floor plans, people speaking in low, confident tones about deadlines and image campaigns. Calvin worked 2 floors above me, in a department focused on financial operations. Our paths didn't cross often, but when they did, the air seemed to tighten around us. He was always surrounded by people, projecting charm like a stage actor. He'd learned to blend arrogance with professionalism, the same trick he once used in our relationship. But here, it was easier to watch him from a distance, to see the cracks forming in his performance. It didn't take long to recognize the patterns. He had the same tactics: flattery, manipulation, subtle control. I watched him delegate important financial responsibilities to employees too intimidated to question his methods. He was careful, but not careful enough. He had a habit of using company accounts for internal transactions that seemed harmless on paper but didn't add up in practice. The numbers shifted like shadows, small enough to avoid suspicion but consistent enough to form a pattern. I started keeping quiet notes: dates, amounts, people he spoke to, the projects involved. I wasn't collecting for the thrill of revenge anymore. I was building a case. I made sure to stay invisible, friendly, professional, always reliable. Within weeks, people trusted me. I became the go-to person for scheduling, event coordination, and internal memos. The closer I got to the flow of information, the more I saw Calvin's influence tangled in it. One morning, I overheard him on a call through the thin walls near the conference corridor. His voice was low, measured, the same tone he used when he was lying. "No, don't route it directly," he said. "Put it under the community partnership expenses. No one checks those reports." I made a mental note, careful not to linger. It was around that time I met Vivienne properly. She often visited the office, friendly and approachable despite her status. She had an open smile, genuine warmth, and an effortless grace that made people soften around her. I'd seen her in pictures, but in person, she seemed younger than her polished image, idealistic, sincere, unguarded. The first time we spoke, She thanked me for coordinating an internal presentation on short notice. "You're efficient," she said kindly. "People appreciate that around here," I replied modestly, hiding the sharp twist in my chest. She didn't know who I was. To her, I was just another employee doing my job. And to me, she was the unsuspecting woman walking into the same trap I once did. Over time, I made small efforts to stay on her radar without overstepping. I'd volunteer to help with her department's events, stay late to ensure her projects ran smoothly. She began to trust me, asking my opinion on minor details, sharing glimpses of her world. "Calvin's brilliant, isn't he?" she said once with a soft smile. "My father thinks he's one of the most capable people in the company." I nodded politely, masking every emotion that wanted to break through. I wasn't ready to tell her who I was, not yet. Meanwhile, Calvin's suspicion began to surface. I could feel his eyes on me during meetings, the way his tone shifted when he addressed me in front of others. "Darlene, is it?" he'd say, pretending to search for my name as if we were strangers. "I remember you joined recently. You're doing well, I hear." His smirk carried the message he couldn't say aloud: "You can't touch me here." I responded with a calm professionalism that irritated him more than any confrontation could. Every time he tried to provoke me subtly, I met him with indifference. It was my quiet rebellion denying him the satisfaction of seeing fear. The more time I spent in that building, the more certain I became that Calvin hadn't changed. He had simply found a grander stage. He manipulated numbers with the same precision he once used to manipulate hearts. He courted the CEO's favor with charm, masked deceit as competence, and bent everyone around him until they moved in his rhythm. But arrogance breeds carelessness, and his cracks were widening. One evening, long after most employees had left, I was gathering my things when I heard voices down the corridor. Calvin's tone caught my attention, sharp, urgent. I moved closer, keeping out of sight. He was speaking with a man from the finance team, his voice low but distinct. "The Montgomery Foundation," he said. "If we funnel the transfers through the charity accounts, the audit won't trace it. It's all clean money on paper." My breath caught. Charity accounts, the one area even the CEO treated as sacred. He wasn't just stealing now, he was risking the company's reputation for greed. The man hesitated, murmuring something I couldn't hear, but Calvin cut him off. "Just do as I said. I'll handle the oversight." I stepped back quietly, heart pounding. The irony of it all struck me years ago. He'd framed me for embezzlement, and now he was about to do the same thing again, only on a much larger scale. But this time, I wasn't powerless. This time, I was watching. As I left the building that night, the city lights reflected off the glass facade, and for the first time, I felt the shift of power. I wasn't the same Darlene he once controlled. I had a plan, evidence, and patience. He didn't know it yet, but his world was starting to crack, and I would be there when it collapsed. The day Vivienne cried in my office, I knew my chance had come. It had been months since I'd joined Meridian, and the quiet routine of calculated observation had become second nature. I was careful, methodical, invisible when I needed to be. Calvin had continued to move through the building like a self-appointed king, all charm and strategy, but I had learned his rhythms now, how he spoke when he lied, how his confidence sharpened when he was plotting something. I'd been gathering small fragments of evidence, nothing that could stand on its own, but enough to draw a pattern. What I hadn't expected was that the key to bringing him down would walk right into my office, mascara running and composure gone. Vivienne rarely looked anything but immaculate. She carried herself with that polished grace of someone raised in boardrooms and media headlines. But that afternoon she was shaking. Her usual poise had cracked open, revealing something raw and deeply human. She closed my office door behind her and leaned against it, whispering, "I'm sorry. I just needed a minute away from everyone." I stood, unsure how to comfort her without overstepping, but she waved her hand weakly and said, "Please, don't treat me like the boss's daughter right now. Just a person having a bad day." She sat down across from me, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. "It's Calvin," she finally said. and my pulse quickened, though my expression stayed calm. He's been so distant lately. He hides his phone, leaves without explanation, and when I ask what's wrong, he turns it around on me as if I'm overreacting. Her voice broke, and she laughed bitterly. My father thinks he's wonderful. Everyone does. But sometimes I feel like I'm losing my mind. I knew that feeling too well. I remembered those same questions, that same emotional whiplash, how Calvin could make you doubt your own sanity with a single sigh. I chose my words carefully. People like that, I said softly. They're good at making you feel responsible for their secrets. She looked up, startled, as if I had read her mind. You've met someone like that before? She asked. I hesitated, pretending to think, then nodded. Yes, I said slowly. Someone very much like that. That was how our friendship began. It wasn't planned. It evolved quietly, naturally, through shared work on the company's charity division. Vivienne wanted to create a new outreach campaign, her passion project. I volunteered to help coordinate logistics, staying late in the office with her while the rest of the building emptied out. We talked while sorting paperwork, conversations that began with budgets and ended with confessions. She was intelligent and kind, but deeply lonely, suffocating under her father's expectations and Calvin's manipulations. The more she spoke, the more I saw my past, playing out in her present. One evening, after a particularly long day, we sat in my office eating takeout out of paper boxes. She looked exhausted but relieved to be away from the boardroom politics. You know what's strange? She said between bites. I can't shake the feeling that Calvin's hiding something from my father. He's been managing parts of the foundation budget lately, but he's so protective of the files. He even told me not to worry about details. She smiled sadly. It's probably nothing, right? I wanted to scream that it wasn't nothing, that it was exactly how he started with me, but I didn't. I leaned forward and asked gently, Has he ever kept financial matters secret from you before? She frowned, considering. Sometimes, she admitted. But he says it's to protect me from stress. The irony stung. That line was his favorite. Over the next few weeks, I nurtured that fragile trust. I didn't push. I listened. And, slowly, Vivienne began to open up completely. She shared her doubts, her frustrations, even small moments of anger that she'd never dared to voice. Sometimes I wonder, she confessed once, if I even know who he really is. I met her gaze and replied quietly, Maybe it's time you find out. The moment to reveal my truth came unexpectedly. It was late one evening, long after most employees had gone home. We were reviewing donation reports when Vivienne found an inconsistency. This number doesn't match, she said, brow furrowing. The same transaction shows twice but under different departments. I leaned closer and recognized the formatting Calvin's work. He used the same tactic years ago when he hid the fraud under my name. I felt a chill run down my spine. Vivienne, I said carefully, there's something you need to know about Calvin. And about me. Her eyes widened. What do you mean? She asked. I took a deep breath and told her. Everything from the moment I met him to the night I was arrested in my own kitchen. I didn't dramatize it. I just laid it out plainly, fact by fact, the way you tell a story you've already cried through 1,000 times. At first, she just sat there, stunned. That can't be true, she whispered. He's not like that with me. I nodded. He wasn't like that with me at first either. That's how he works. He builds trust, collects information, and uses it when you least expect it. You're not the first person he's deceived, and you won't be the last unless you see it now. She looked torn, disbelief and fear battling across her face. You could be lying, she said softly. You could have a reason to hate him. I didn't argue. Instead, I opened my drawer and handed her a small folder I'd been compiling. You should decide for yourself. Inside were printed bank summaries, internal memos, and the first set of discrepancies I'd quietly tracked since joining Meridian. These aren't enough to go to authorities, I explained. Not yet, but they're real. She studied the papers in silence, her hands shaking slightly as she turned the pages. The color drained from her face. "I've seen this account number," she murmured. "It's part of the Foundation's charity fund." I nodded. "Exactly. He's using the same method again, reclassifying funds under legitimate expenses." She closed the folder slowly, her jaw tightening. When she looked up at me, her eyes were no longer filled with disbelief, they were blazing with anger. "If this is true," she said, her voice trembling but fierce, "I'm going to help you expose him." From that night on, we became unlikely partners. Vivienne used her access to gather information from within Calvin's circle emails, meeting notes, schedules while I organized and cross-referenced the data. We met discreetly in my office, speaking in low voices, careful not to leave traces. For the first time, I saw in her the same determination that had kept me alive all these years. She was young, but she was sharper than Calvin ever gave her credit for. As our evidence grew, so did our bond. She confided in me about her father's disappointment in her personal choices, about the pressure to uphold the family's image. I offered advice quietly, like a mother might. "You don't need to be anyone's decoration," I told her once, "especially not for a man who builds his success on lies." She smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who's done being lied to." "I am," I said, "and you should be too." Weeks later, the company buzzed with sudden excitement. Richard Montgomery had announced a grand live charity broadcast, a televised event to celebrate Meridian's achievements and raise funds for their foundation. Vivienne came to me that morning, her face pale. "Guess who's in charge of the finances and planning?" she whispered. I didn't need to ask. Calvin's name was already printed on the internal memo she handed me. The trap was practically setting itself. Calvin was about to put himself in the spotlight again, surrounded by cameras, money, and the illusion of generosity. I felt the familiar thrum of purpose in my chest. This time, he wouldn't walk away untouched. Revenge was no longer my only motivation, justice was. In the weeks leading up to the live charity broadcast, Vivienne and I worked like two women bound by a silent urgency. What started as an alliance built on shared pain had evolved into something deeper, a mission that neither of us could walk away from. The evidence was finally beginning to form a coherent picture. Bank transfers hidden under community projects, donations routed through fake subsidiaries, emails coded with obscure references that, when decoded, exposed Calvin's intricate scheme. Each discovery felt like peeling away another layer of his deceit, revealing the man behind the performance. Most nights, Vivienne stayed late in my office. The building would grow quiet after 9, leaving only the distant hum of cleaning staff and the faint glow of city lights spilling through the windows. We'd sit side by side at my desk, reviewing spreadsheets and voice recordings, our whispers barely above the sound of the computer's fan. She was quick to learn her father's sharpness paired with her own intuitive insight. The more she unearthed, the harder it became for her to hide her emotions. Sometimes she'd stop mid-sentence, her voice trembling. "He told me I was his safe place," she said once, staring blankly at the monitor. "All that time he was stealing from us." I placed a hand gently over hers. "He's good at convincing people he's everything they need. But he's always been the same underneath." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "I guess now I know how he made you fall for him too." There was no accusation, in her tone only empathy. That was the night I realized she wasn't just my ally. She had become something close to the daughter I never had. I wanted to protect her from what I had endured. But more than that, I wanted her to reclaim the power he'd stolen. As our investigation deepened, Vivienne managed to access encrypted internal files tied to the company's charity accounts. Within them, she found proof of false donations, money meant for community projects that had been rerouted into Calvin's private accounts overseas. The pattern was undeniable. He had used his position to drain funds from the very cause that made Meridian look so noble. "He's using people's goodwill as a cover," Vivienne whispered, scrolling through the figures. "He's not just stealing, he's dismantling everything my father built." I could see the hurt in her eyes. The conflict between love for her father's company and the shame of being connected to its corruption. We began transferring all the evidence to a private encrypted drive that only we could access. Jessa, who had remained quietly in the background, helped us set up secure communications, anonymous email addresses, VPNs, even recorded voice memos disguised as work files. Every piece of evidence we gathered became another thread in the noose Calvin had unknowingly woven for himself. But with every step forward came the reminder that one wrong move could unravel it all. To get closer to the heart of Calvin's operation, I had to do something that tested every ounce of strength I had. I had to pretend to reconcile with him. The idea came during one of our late-night strategy sessions. He'll never let his guard down if he thinks you're against him, Vivienne reasoned. But if he believes you've forgiven him, he might brag. He always does when he feels invincible. She was right. His ego had always been his weakness. The next day, I caught him alone in the break area. He looked up from his coffee as I approached, suspicion flickering across his face. "Long time, no real talk," I said lightly. "I think we got off on the wrong foot when I joined." He smirked, his confidence returning instantly. "Water under the bridge, Darlene. We've both moved on, haven't we?" I smiled faintly. "Of course." I made small talk, careful to sound casual, curious, almost apologetic. It didn't take long before he began boasting again, dropping hints about his untouchable reputation and how deeply Richard Montgomery trusted him. Over the following days, I played the part well cordial, mildly impressed, occasionally seeking his advice as if trying to mend old wounds. He took the bait completely. One afternoon, he leaned back in his chair and said with that smug grin, "You know, people like us, we survive, no matter what they throw our way." I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "Even if someone tried to expose you?" He laughed softly, tapping his chest. "They'd have to find something first. And trust me, there's nothing left to find." If only he knew how wrong he was. Meanwhile, Vivienne was struggling to keep her emotions contained. Her composure wavered more with each passing day. She still had to face him at home, sitting through dinners where he charmed her father with his false integrity. "He looks my father in the eye and calls him a mentor," she whispered one night, pacing my office. "It makes me sick." I watched her with quiet admiration. She was young, but her courage was something rare. "Let him keep talking," I told her. "Every word he says digs his own grave a little deeper." The hardest part was keeping her father out of it. Richard Montgomery was a man who valued loyalty above all else, and he trusted Calvin completely. If we told him prematurely, he might dismiss it as emotional overreaction, or worse, alert Calvin. We needed him to see the truth himself, undeniable, public, and irreversible. That was when Vivienne had the idea. "The live charity broadcast," she said, her eyes suddenly bright with purpose. "It's being handled by the media division, and my father will be there on stage. What if that's when we show the truth? The money trail, the transfers, everything live, in front of everyone." I hesitated, the enormity of it hitting me. It was bold, risky, and dangerously poetic. "If it works," I said slowly, "he'll never recover." "And if it doesn't?" she asked. "Then we'll both lose everything," I admitted. But the more we planned it, the more it made sense. The broadcast would have millions of viewers. Calvin would be in charge of the financial presentation, confident and unaware. Vivienne would coordinate with the media team to ensure a hidden switch in the feed. When the time came, our pre-recorded compilation bank transfers, audio snippets, and documents would air instead of his speech. It was foolproof, if executed precisely. In the quiet hours before dawn, as we finalized the plan, I watched Vivienne scrolling through the final set of evidence on her laptop. "You know," she said softly, not looking up, "I don't think I could have done this without you." Her words caught me off guard. I smiled faintly. "And I couldn't have done it without you either." I meant it. For the first time in years, I felt something that wasn't bitterness or grief, it was connection. By the end of that week, everything was in place. The files were loaded onto a secure drive, the presentation rehearsed, the switch planned to perfection. We even coordinated a backup with Jessa, in case things went wrong. I could feel the air tightening around us, like the moment before a storm. Then, on the eve of the broadcast, everything nearly came crashing down. I was at home when my phone buzzed with a message from Vivienne. "We have a problem." My heart sank as I called her immediately. Her voice was trembling. "He found one of my emails," she whispered. "The one with the transaction screenshots." He saw it. For a long, terrible moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear her uneven breathing through the phone. "Does he know it was meant for me?" I asked. "I don't think so," she said. "But he's suspicious. He asked me strange questions tonight about loyalty, about who I trust at work." The trap we'd built so carefully had suddenly shifted, and now the predator was beginning to sense the hunters. The broadcast was less than 24 hours away, and one wrong word could ruin everything. I could feel my past and present crashing together, and I wasn't sure I'd survive the impact. The day before the broadcast felt like a countdown I couldn't stop. Every minute pulsed with the weight of what we were about to do. Every breath heavy with both fear and determination. I woke before dawn, pacing my apartment in silence, rehearsing the conversation in my mind that I knew would change everything. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming truth in front of the same kind of audience that once watched my life collapse. Tomorrow, the world would finally see who Calvin really was, and who I had become. By mid-morning, Vivienne called. Her voice was calm on the surface, but I could hear the strain underneath. "He confronted me," she said quickly. "He found the email last night, but I told him it was part of a random internal audit my father requested. I said I was checking charity reports." My heart clenched. "Did he believe you?" There was a pause before she answered. "He's suspicious. But he also thinks I'm too naive to lie to him. That arrogance is saving us right now." I could almost see the look on Calvin's face, the calculating suspicion hiding behind that smooth smile. At the office, everyone was buzzing about the broadcast. The charity gala had become the company's crown jewel event, televised live across the country. Reporters, sponsors, and guests were already arriving for rehearsals. The stage was set in the main auditorium, a glass-walled hall that reflected the city lights at night, symbolizing transparency. The irony wasn't lost on me. Calvin stood in the center of it all, adjusting his tie and charming the production crew like a seasoned politician. His laughter carried across the room, confident and hollow. I stayed composed, pretending not to notice the undercurrent between us. He looked at me once just long enough for his expression to flicker. That faint smirk told me he hadn't entirely dismissed his suspicion. Still, he didn't have proof. He thought he was in control, and that would be his downfall. "Everything ready for tomorrow, Darlene?" he asked casually, his tone dripping with condescension. "Absolutely," I replied, matching his calmness. "This presentation will make quite an impression." He smiled, clearly missing the double meaning. Vivienne joined us later for rehearsal, her demeanor flawless despite the tension simmering beneath her calm exterior. She had inherited her father's ability to command a room without raising her voice. Watching her, I felt a quiet pride she wasn't the same uncertain woman who once cried in my office. She had become resolute, fearless, and far more strategic than Calvin realized. As we ran through the event order, she gave subtle cues to the production team. At a specific signal during the live broadcast, the real presentation, the one with Calvin's embezzlement evidence, would replace his pre-approved slides. No one outside our small circle knew what was coming. While the crew adjusted lights and sound, I stepped aside to call Jessa. She was in her office, surrounded by documents and legal authorizations. "Everything's set on my end," she assured me. "If he tries to sue or retaliate after the broadcast, the evidence goes public immediately. You're covered." Her voice steadied me. Jessa had been my anchor since the day I'd been handcuffed in my own kitchen. Hearing her speak with quiet confidence reminded me how far I'd come. "Thank you," I said softly. "For everything." She smiled through the line. "Finish what you started, Darlene. Just remember justice, not chaos." The rehearsal stretched into late evening. Calvin strutted through the hall like the star of his own movie, giving directions and practicing his speech in front of the mirror. He talked about transparency, compassion, The importance of integrity, every word another layer of hypocrisy. I watched him from a distance, feeling a strange calm instead of anger. He'd stolen years from me, yet in that moment, it was clear he hadn't really won anything. He was still trapped in his web of lies, feeding off the illusion of power that would vanish the moment truth hit daylight. During a break, Vivienne approached me quietly. He said, "He's planning something for tomorrow," she murmured. "Something personal." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Her expression tightened. "He told me he might make a special announcement during the broadcast. I think he's going to propose." The audacity made my stomach turn. It was exactly the kind of grand gesture Calvin would use to cement his image proposing on live television while hiding behind stolen money. "He's trying to seal his narrative," I said, realizing the twisted perfection of his timing. "If he proposes, the world will see him as the devoted partner." "We can't let that be the story." Vivienne nodded firmly. "Then we make sure the truth comes out before he gets the chance to speak his lies." The determination in her eyes made me both proud and terrified. She was walking a fine line, one slip could drag her into his downfall. "Are you ready for what happens after?" I asked quietly. "Your father, the press," hesitated only for a second before answering. "I'd rather face shame for exposing him than live as the woman who helped him deceive millions." That night, after everyone left, I stayed behind in the empty auditorium. The lights dimmed to a soft glow, and the echo of footsteps faded until only silence remained. I stood on the stage where tomorrow everything would unfold, feeling the weight of the moment settle into my bones. This was where I would reclaim my life in front of cameras, under blinding lights, where the whole world could finally see who the real liar was. I placed my hand on the podium, the cold surface grounding me in reality. I wasn't the woman who had been humiliated and erased anymore. I was the woman who had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, until she was strong enough to face the man who thought he'd broken her. Before leaving, I double-checked the presentation files one last time. The final version, labeled innocently as Charity Growth Report, contained every piece of evidence we'd collected. Hidden within its slides were documents, screenshots, and recordings that would play automatically once Vivienne's signal was triggered. There would be no stopping it. Even if Calvin tried to intervene, the truth would already be out. As I closed my laptop, I caught sight of my reflection in the dark glass wall. For a brief second, I saw the woman I used to be, hopeful, trusting, naive, standing beside the woman I had become. They were the same person, but the difference between them was survival. When I stepped outside, the night air felt colder than usual, sharp and expectant. I called Vivienne before heading home. "Get some rest," I told her gently. "Tomorrow will be long." She laughed quietly, though her voice trembled slightly. "I don't think I'll sleep, but I'll try." There was a pause, then she added softly, "Thank you, Darlene, for everything. I wouldn't have made it this far without—" I smiled despite the ache in my chest. "You made it because you found your strength, not because of me." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every step that had brought me here. From the betrayal and the arrest to this moment of fragile power, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready. The next morning arrived with a blinding sunrise that painted the city in gold. As I entered the studio, the energy was electric, cameras being tested, reporters chatting, guests taking their seats. Calvin stood center stage in his tailored suit, rehearsing his opening line one last time. He looked untouchable, every inch the hero he pretended to be. The audience hushed as the countdown began. "Live in 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked on. Calvin stepped forward to speak, his practiced smile gleaming under the stage lights. And that was the moment I moved, stepping out from behind the curtain and onto the stage, every eye turning toward me. The audience gasped. Calvin froze mid-sentence, and my heart pounded like thunder in my chest. Millions watched as I walked into the spotlight with the truth in my hand. The brightness of the stage lights hit me first, blinding and hot, while the collective gasp from the audience rippled through the hall like a breaking wave. The broadcast was live, cameras rolling, and every second stretched like eternity. Calvin froze mid-sentence, his expression a flicker of confusion that quickly turned to disbelief. He wasn't expecting me not here, not now, not when he believed he was about to seal his image as the company's shining savior. "Darlene?" he said, his voice carefully pitched, half a smile frozen on his face. "This isn't part of the program." I stepped closer to the podium, calm but resolute. "It's not," I replied evenly, "but I think it's time people hear what this program is really funding." A murmur swept across the audience. Behind the cameras, I caught a glimpse of Vivienne at the technical booth, her face pale but steady. She gave the smallest nod the signal. Within seconds, the control room switched the feed, replacing Calvin's pre-approved slides with the files we had prepared. On the giant screen behind us, the company's logo disappeared, replaced by a spreadsheet of transactions, donation amounts, account numbers, false invoices. The figures were undeniable, all linked directly to Calvin's authorization. "What is this?" he demanded, his tone still controlled but his eyes darting toward the monitors. The audience leaned forward as the first set of emails appeared, showing conversations between Calvin and his shell contacts overseas. Each message revealed another layer of deceit, his orders to reroute charitable funds, his mocking remarks about fooling the idealists. "Stop this now," he hissed toward the camera crew, but no one moved. The feed was live and out of his control. I turned to him calmly. "You stole from people who trusted you. You built your success on lies and ruined lives to protect yourself. And I would know because one of those lives was mine." My voice didn't tremble. It rang clear, sharp enough to pierce the silence that followed. Gasps filled the room as I spoke, my story unfolding like a confession delivered to the world. I told them how I had once been framed by Calvin for crimes I never committed, how he used me as a scapegoat when his first company collapsed, and how he walked free while I lost everything. The crowd murmured louder, disbelief turning into outrage. The studio's chat feed, visible on side monitors, began flooding with messages, viewers demanding answers, calling for accountability. Behind me, the slides continued cycling, proof layered over proof. Signatures, bank statements, even snippets of the recorded call where Calvin bragged about how she never reads what she signs. Each revelation drew sharper gasps. Calvin's composure cracked. "This is ridiculous!" he shouted, his voice rising as he turned to the cameras. "These files are fabricated. She's mentally unstable. She's been obsessed with me for years." Vivienne's father, Richard Montgomery, appeared then, striding onto the stage from the side entrance. His face was stone, no warmth, no disbelief, just fury masked by restraint. "Calvin," he said coldly. "Explain this. Now." Calvin stammered, trying to gather his charm, but his words collided in panic. "Sir, this is all a setup. Darlene has been trying to ruin me ever since." He stopped when Richard raised a hand, silencing him. "I trusted you," Richard said, his voice low but carrying through the room. "You managed the foundation's funds personally. Are you telling me every dollar we donated to schools and hospitals was a lie?" Calvin looked trapped, eyes darting between Richard, Vivienne, and the cameras. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "I did what I had to for the company's survival," he said quickly. "You wouldn't understand the pressure." The audience erupted in disapproval. He tried to talk over the noise, but every attempt made him sound smaller, more desperate. Vivienne stepped onto the stage next. Her expression was calm, but her voice shook with controlled emotion. "You lied to my father. You lied to me. You used our name to cover your theft." She turned toward the cameras. "And this woman," she gestured toward me, "was one of your victims before you ever set foot in this building." Calvin's face drained of color. "Vivienne, don't do this here," he pleaded. "You'll regret it." "No," she said softly. "The only thing I regret is believing you were ever capable of love or integrity." The audience clapped, the sound swelling into thunder. Calvin's arrogance finally cracked. He grabbed the microphone, voice trembling between anger and disbelief. "You're making a mistake. You think anyone will believe her? She's nothing, she's—" His sentence cut short as security personnel approached the stage. His composure dissolved completely. Get your hands off me, he barked, struggling as they escorted him toward the wings. It wasn't violent, but his desperation filled the air like static. Meanwhile, the broadcast continued uninterrupted. The camera focused on the screen as the final slide appeared, an image of Calvin's offshore account summaries. The audience gasped again, the evidence irrefutable now. The murmurs turned into applause, a mix of outrage and vindication. Richard stepped forward and spoke directly into the microphone. On behalf of Meridian Media, I want to apologize to every donor, employee, and community partner who trusted this organization. Effective immediately, Calvin Blake has been terminated. We will cooperate fully with law enforcement. As his words echoed through the room, Calvin's voice faded into the distance, swallowed by chaos and flashes from the press cameras. For the first time in years, I felt the world tilt back toward balance. The truth wasn't just spoken, it was witnessed. When it was my turn to speak again, I took a slow breath and looked out into the sea of faces. Years ago, I began, I was accused of crimes I didn't commit. I lost my reputation, my peace, and my trust in people. But I learned something important. When the truth is buried long enough, it doesn't die. It waits. And when it rises, it brings everything hidden into the light. The room was silent. I looked toward Vivienne, her eyes glistening but steady. This was never just about revenge. It was about justice. About ending a cycle of deceit that should have stopped long ago. Applause erupted again, not the polite kind, but the kind that carries emotion, that feels like release. Reporters shouted questions, flashes went off like fireworks, but I barely heard them. I felt light-free in a way I hadn't, since before Calvin came into my life. Vivienne stood beside me, shoulders squared, her father behind her, the full weight of truth finally visible under the blinding studio lights. Security returned, followed by 2 uniformed officers. The camera caught the moment Calvin was led out head down, his once perfect composure shattered. The crowd fell quiet as the image flashed on the big screen, live for millions to see. It wasn't triumph I felt watching him, it was closure. The kind that doesn't need applause or validation. The broadcast cut to a commercial break soon after, but the studio stayed buzzing with chaos, journalists swarming, staff whispering, phones ringing non-stop. Amid it all, Vivienne turned to me. Her eyes, though tired, carried something bright: admiration, maybe gratitude. You did it, she said softly. No, I corrected her, smiling faintly. We did it. She was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that caught me off guard. What if we made this partnership permanent? I blinked, not sure I understood. You mean? She nodded. You and me. Running the foundation together. Rebuilding what he destroyed. My father already trusts you more than anyone else in this room. For a moment, I couldn't speak. After years of being defined by what Calvin took from me, I was finally being offered a chance to create something new. I'll think about it, I said, though in my heart I already knew the answer. As the cameras powered down and the crowd slowly dispersed, I stood at the edge of the stage, watching technicians clear the equipment. The same spot where my life had once ended had now become the place it truly began again. I didn't just destroy him, I rebuilt myself. It had been 6 months since that unforgettable day on live television, the day truth finally stepped out from the shadows and stood in front of millions. The broadcast became one of the most replayed moments in Meridian Media's history. Reporters called it the reckoning of the year, and while the world was fascinated by the scandal, for me it wasn't about headlines or applause. It was about breathing again without the weight of shame pressing against my ribs. For the first time in years, I wasn't a woman defined by what I'd lost, I was someone who had reclaimed everything that mattered. Calvin's arrest made national news. Within weeks, the authorities completed their investigation, and the case against him was airtight. The stolen funds were traced, the falsified records confirmed, and his offshore accounts frozen. During his trial, he tried to twist the story one last time, blaming corporate pressures and a vengeful ex. But this time, no one listened. The evidence spoke louder than his charm ever could. When the judge read his sentence, 12 years for corporate fraud and financial misconduct, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. There was no joy in watching a man fall, only peace in knowing he'd never destroy another person's life the way he had mine. In the months that followed, Meridian Media underwent a transformation. Richard Montgomery moved swiftly to rebuild the company's integrity, and the foundation that Calvin had exploited was restructured under new leadership. That leadership, surprisingly, included me. Vivienne had kept her promise. She convinced her father to let us co-manage the charity branch, focusing on transparency and rebuilding trust with the public. "No one understands accountability better than you," she'd told me, and there was truth in that. The first few weeks were difficult, full of scrutiny from investors and wary staff, but I stayed focused. Every new project, every honest donation, felt like another brick laid in the foundation of my own redemption. Working with Vivienne became one of the greatest gifts that came from this entire storm. She had grown into her own power, poised, decisive, yet still kind. I admired her resilience. She admired my strength. Together, we turned what had once been a tool for deceit into a platform for genuine good. We expanded community scholarships, launched programs for underprivileged youth, and made transparency our mission. "No secrets," we would say at every board meeting, a quiet nod to the ghosts of what we'd both survived. The media's attention eventually shifted from the scandal to the rebuilding. Articles appeared with headlines like, "From Victim to Visionary," "The Woman Who Took Her Life Back," and "Darlene Hart, the Face of Resilience." For years, my name had been whispered in pity and suspicion. Now, people spoke it with respect. I was invited to speak at women's conferences, to share my story about overcoming manipulation and injustice. At first, I hesitated, worried that revisiting those memories would reopen old wounds. But each time I stood before an audience, telling them that healing doesn't come from revenge but from reclaiming control, I felt lighter. Jessa remained a steady presence through it all. She refused any compensation for her help, insisting that seeing my freedom was enough. Sometimes, we'd meet for dinner after long workdays, talking about how far everything had come. "You know," she said one evening, swirling her tea with a faint smile, "I used to think justice came from the courtroom. But watching you taught me that real justice happens when you stop letting your past dictate your future." I smiled. "You're the one who helped me believe that again." Even Richard Montgomery, a man who rarely admitted fault, approached me one afternoon in his office. "I owe you an apology," he said gruffly, his voice carrying that weight of a man unused to such words. "For trusting the wrong person and for doubting the right one. My daughter speaks of you with great admiration. You've given this company something no amount of money could buy: integrity." I told him the truth. All I ever wanted was for the truth to be seen. Not for revenge, but for closure. He nodded solemnly, then added, "You've done more than that. You've rebuilt something that should have broken completely." Vivienne and I became almost inseparable in our work. There was a kind of unspoken understanding between us. She filled a space in my heart I hadn't realized was empty. One evening after an award ceremony, as we stood in the quiet of the backstage corridor, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "You're more than my mentor, Darlene," she said softly. "You're my second mother." Her words broke something open inside me. The years of loneliness, loss, and guilt dissolved in that moment. I hugged her tightly, not as a colleague but as someone who had found family in the most unexpected place. In small ways, the world around me began to feel kind again. My neighbors, who once avoided eye contact when I passed, now stopped to greet me warmly. The local library, the same one I'd left behind in shame, invited me to lead a book drive. Even the media coverage eventually softened, shifting from scandal to redemption. But more than any public praise, it was the quiet moments that meant the most: waking up each morning without dread, sipping coffee without trembling hands, looking at my reflection and recognizing the woman in the mirror again. Sometimes, I still thought about Calvin, not with bitterness, but with a strange detachment. He had once seemed larger than life, the center of my universe. Now, he was just a chapter closed. I'd visited the courthouse the day his sentencing was finalized, not to gloat, but to make peace with the past. Watching him being led away, shoulders slumped, I realized the difference between us. He had spent his life building illusions. I had spent mine rebuilding truth. One afternoon, months later, Vivienne and I stood on a stage again, but this time, it wasn't for a confrontation, it was for celebration. The foundation had reached record donations for real, transparent causes. The air was filled with laughter, not tension. Reporters lined the aisles, but now they were there to document progress, not scandal. Vivienne took the microphone first, thanking the donors, the volunteers, and the staff. Then she turned to me and said, "And there's one person without whom none of this would exist, my mentor, my friend, and the woman who reminded us all what integrity looks like. Darlene Hart." The applause was thunderous, echoing across the hall. I stepped up to the podium, feeling the warmth of it, the sincerity. 6 months ago, I began. I thought my story had already been written, one filled with betrayal and loss. But life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes, it breaks us to rebuild us stronger. What happened wasn't just about justice, it was about rediscovering who I am. My eyes found Vivienne in the crowd. He took my life once, but I took it back live, and forever. After the event, as the hall slowly emptied, I lingered on the stage, the hum of conversation fading into the distance. The same lights that once blinded me during chaos now felt gentle, almost forgiving. Vivienne joined me, smiling. "You finally look at peace," she said. I nodded. "Because I am." As we walked out together, I glanced back one last time. The stage that had once been a battlefield was now a symbol of renewal. My revenge had never been about destroying Calvin in the end, it had been about finding myself beyond him. And in doing so, I learned the sweetest revenge of all, to live better, freer, and with nothing left to prove. When I look back now, I don't see the woman he tried to destroy, I see the one who refused to stay broken. Justice didn't come from anger, it came from patience and truth. Calvin lost everything he built on lies, but I found something stronger than revenge, peace. I didn't just survive what he did to me. I turned it into my beginning. If my story taught you that silence can be the loudest kind of strength, don't forget to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe one small story can remind another woman she's not alone. And tell me, if the person who once destroyed your life came begging for forgiveness one day, would you forgive them? Or let them taste their own medicine?